All right, we're going to start Chapter 6 Notes, Part 3, which is going to go into skeletal muscle cell physiology, or actions. All right? So I want you to stop and think about what causes a skeletal muscle to function. Well, a skeletal muscle does its job, which is contracting, because it is innervated, which means that it has a nerve, or the nervous system, telling it what to do. And we're really going to look at the communication between the nerve cell and the muscle cell right now. So muscle cells basically have to have 4 different properties. They have to be responsive, meaning that they have the ability to respond to a stimulus coming from the nervous system. Sometimes our muscle cells don't always respond, all right, when we have a stimulus coming from the nervous system. You might have heard of people who have, quote-unquote, hit a wall. That means that there might be a stimulus coming from the nervous system, but the muscles are so fatigued that they just can't do anything. The other thing is that the muscle has to be able to contract, so the sarcomeres have to be able to shorten to slide. They have to be able to stretch or move with the extensibility, and then they have to be able to retain go back to whatever original state they were in, so that elasticity. So basically, in order to contract, skeletal muscle has to have an impulse or a stimulus coming from a nerve, all right? So one nerve cell and all the skeletal muscle cells that it stimulates to contract is called a motor unit, all right? Let me back up for a second. A motor neuron is a neuron is a type of nerve cell. So a motor neuron is the type of nerve cell that's going to interface with a skeletal muscle cell and stimulate it to do its job. And a nerve cell, and I know we haven't talked about neuron anatomy yet, but a nerve cell branches into a couple to hundreds of different things called axon terminals. And so one nerve cell could stimulate anywhere from 1 to 100, different muscle cells at one time. So in a nerve cell, all right, we're going to look at the anatomy in just a second, but let me go forward for a second. Here we go. So this is a nerve cell, all right? This is a shortened version of it, because nerve cells are also called fibers like muscle cells because they're elongated. But there is this cell body here, and then there is this long thing called an axon, and then the axon will split into a bunch of different things called axon terminals. Every single muscle cell is going to interact with an axon terminal, okay? And there's only going to be one axon terminal that's going to stimulate that muscle cell to contract. And so this neuron, its axon, is broken into 4 axon terminals. So that means that, if we're talking about skeletal muscle cells, there's 4 skeletal muscle cells that this nerve cell could end up stimulating, if that makes sense. So let me go back for a second. So again, nerve cells are long, they're thread-like, they have these this sending process. Let me go back here. So these are called dendrites, and they receive a stimulus from the brain or the spinal cord. And then they send this stimulus down their axon, and it reaches the end of this axon terminal. And then at the end of this axon terminal, there's going to be some sort of cell, okay? So in this case, we're talking about a skeletal muscle cell, but this could be an eye cell or a stomach cell or what have you. But in this chapter specifically, we're saying that after the axon terminal, there's going to be a space called the synaptic cleft, and then there's going to be a postsynaptic cell. And for this chapter, we're saying that the postsynaptic cell is a skeletal muscle cell. So the axon terminals, all right, are going to form junctions, okay, or they're going to meet up with the sarcolemma of a skeletal muscle cell, and they're going to make a neuromuscular junction. And I know I talked about this in class at some point, but nerve cells get really close to other cells, but they do not touch. They leave a space, and that space between a nerve cell and whatever other cell they're interfacing with is called the synaptic cleft, or the synapse. So here are the individual muscle cells, and then this is you can see this axon coming down here, and it's branching into different axon terminals. And every one of these skeletal muscle cells is only going to have one axon terminal that's going to interface with it. So here we see this axon terminal right here, okay? And it's hard to tell in this picture, but there is a space between this axon terminal and this muscle cell. And you see all these little bundles right here. These are little bundles of neurotransmitters. And this is going to make sense a little further down the line. So here we go. That right here is this. So taking this right here and right here, this is a version of that right here. Okay. So this is the neuromuscular junction. This is where the axon terminal and the sarcolemma meet. So here we have the axon, all right, and this is the axon terminal. And what this blue arrow is showing is that there's an action potential being sent down the axon. Well, what the heck is an action potential? So the way in which cells communicate with each other is electric, and it's also chemical. And an action potential is a flow of ions across the plasma membrane, which causes an electrical current change. So what's happening down the length of this axon is sodium ions are rushing into the cell, causing an electrical gradient change. And that wave is happening down the entire length of this axon. Well, now it gets to the axon terminal. And there's going to be a series of events that happen, and I'll probably make a whole separate video talking about this. I actually have one, okay, that I'll share with you folks. But this current comes all the way down to the axon terminal. And if you think about, if you've ever taken physics or done anything with electrical circuits, so this action potential is supposed to stimulate this muscle cell. Well, these two aren't touching, so this is not a closed circuit. So how the heck are we going to get this signal which says, hey, you need to contract and do something, when there's this space here, there's this closed circuit? Well, what ends up happening is that this electrical current or action potential that's flowing down this axon terminal opens up some voltage-gated calcium channels. So they're basically turned on by an electrical current, which causes calcium to come in. Calcium then stimulates, these are little vesicles of neurotransmitter, okay, to be exocytosed, ooh, chapter 3 word, into the synaptic cleft. So they're coming over here, some vesicular transport. Now we have, these are neurotransmitters. They are transmitting the nerve signal from this axon terminal to the postsynaptic cell, which happens to be a skeletal muscle cell. And the neurotransmitter that is involved with muscle contraction is acetylcholine. So these little red doodads right here, these are all acetylcholine, or you're going to see it marked as ACH. So, just to recap, electrical current or action potential flows down the axon, reaches the axon terminal, stimulates voltage-gated calcium channels to open. Calcium rushes in. Calcium stimulates, this would be number 3, the exocytosis of neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter, in this case, is going to be acetylcholine. Acetylcholine, or ACH, is going to travel down its concentration gradient across the synaptic cleft, which is this space right here, and they're going to bind on to these little channels. These are ligand-gated sodium channels, and what they're calling them here is neurotransmitter-gated channels. Another way is saying ligand-gated. Up here, these were voltage-gated. They were turned on by electrical current. Down here, these are neurotransmitter-gated channels, or ligand-gated channels. Ligand means there's a substance that has to bind onto the channel to open them. So when acetylcholine comes over and binds onto these sodium channels, they now open. And sodium, thanks to the sodium-potassium pump, lived in a really high concentration on the outside of the cell. So there's an unusual buildup of sodium on the outside of the cell. So when these ligand-gated channels open from ACH, sodium can now rush into the cell. And so that's what it's showing with this arrow. See how this arrow here is really, really large for sodium in, and that this is a small arrow for potassium out. So sodium is rushing into the cell. And what's happening is that when sodium rushes into the cell, it causes a disruption, all right? The disruption is under normal circumstances. I'm going to get a marker or a pen. So under normal circumstances, the cell is negative on the inside and positive on the outside in terms of electricity, okay? And we call that polarized. But with the sodium rushing into the cell, the inside is becoming increasingly more positive or depolarized. And this phenomenon only happens at the neuromuscular junction until a specific number is reached. And we call that specific number or specific voltage the threshold potential. Once we accumulate the threshold potential, all right, so at rest, the cell is like negative 70 millivolts, all right, so negative on the inside. And at this area, it will go to positive 30. Oops, that's supposed to be a 30. Once positive 30 is reached, well, now voltage-gated sodium channels open. So these were ligand-gated. These are voltage-gated. And the action potential, this whole phenomenon that's happening right here, happens throughout the entire cell. And this will end up causing the skeletal muscle cell to contract. But we have to look a little deeper because we're only looking at the sarcolemma and the axon and axon terminal right now. We have to look inside to what's going on with the sarcomeres. So again, that's just showing the axon, axon terminal, neuromuscular junction, and that there's this space, this synapse in between the two. So again, the neurotransmitter that is going to stimulate those ligand-gated sodium channels is acetylcholine. So I'll draw it for you here. So we've got the axon and axon terminal. Here's the sarcolemma. And this right here will be the neuromuscular junction. You have an action potential, which is a wave of electricity that's going to come down here and open calcium, voltage-gated calcium channels. Calcium's going to come into the axon. That calcium is going to stimulate the release of acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is going to come bond onto sodium channels, ligand-gated sodium channels. Sodium, I'm writing with my mouse, sorry. Sodium is now going to rush into the cell. And if this is a cell at rest, it was depolarized, so it was negative on the inside, positive on the outside. Well, we've got this rush of sodium now coming in. That's going to cause this cell to now to become positive on the inside, positive on the outside. When positive 30, that's supposed to be a 3, this is really hard to draw with my finger here, is reached, voltage-gated sodium channels open. And now what's called an action potential, which essentially was just happening right here at the neuromuscular junction, is going to be propagated throughout the entire length of the sarcolemma. And if you remember, we have those things called transverse tubules that come in like this, okay? They are going to bring that current through the cell, And we want that to happen because when that current comes in via those transverse tubules, it's going to stimulate the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium. And as I told you before, calcium is the final go signal for skeletal muscle contraction.